Partha, you and I were talking last week as we were living through this time of COVID change um, about an idea or about a message that's come out from the government to support businesses. And I thought that you have a very interesting perspective. You have in your client base, you provide legal process outsourcing to lawyers and professional service firms. You've got 50 to 60 clients of professional service firms of all sizes. So you have a kind of an overview of a reaction, what reaction is happening in those businesses to these times of change. What do you think, what impact are you seeing around the idea of firms taking that concept of hibernation? How is that impacting in your or in the legal sector that you're seeing, or professional service sector?
That's a very relevant question at the moment, Andrea, and what we discussed last week, and what we are seeing that the term hibernation is being embraced in different ways by different practices, depending on what their view of the current situation is, and also partly, obviously, what their financial situation is, probably in the context of dealing with the current situation. So we are seeing almost like three categories of firms from a strategic viewpoint. One category is petrified or frozen by the shock of what has happened. And there has been some client attrition, but the strategic reaction has been, let's stop everything. We need to stop everything around process mapping, innovation type projects, and hunker down and literally hibernate through this. And we are not sure what shape we would come out at the other end of this. So that's one category. And these are probably more the firms who have the bigger financial impact on from what's happening, or anticipate bigger financial impact. Then there are those who have not experienced yet a 20-30% fall in revenue, but are anticipating some sort of significant impact on their operations. And they are trying very hard to crystal ball this, obviously, how long this will last, whether this will last for the next month or so and have a V-shaped recovery, or whether this is for the long haul. They are also deliberating hard about whether to hibernate or whether to pivot, in terms of what's the trade-off if their financial situation allows them to do it, in terms of continuing some of the projects as a result of what's happening with a view to longer term improvements within the practice, or whether to once again cancel a lot of those type of projects around process mapping, process improvement, and have a bare bones strategy of living through this. Interestingly, within some of the firms within this category still have team members working from the office, and have parts of the team working from home, but there is also some firms where majority are still in the office, and whether that's an outcome of their view around that this would not last too long, and whether,
so they can almost sit it out.
Sit it out, and also whether, not totally an IT related consideration, but how much of their IT infrastructure allows them to move easily is also probably weighing heavily in those instances on them, or whether the pain of moving everyone, as they would put it, into a work from home is worth it or not. So it's a high risk strategy in many ways of how that's evolving in the context of if there was a total lockdown in that instance. And then there is a third category who anticipate that there won't be much financial impact on them as a result of what's happening, but they have still stopped many projects or things that were going to happen. Now, we are unsure, Andrea, in that situation of what's the rationale in that category. You're not expecting a financial impact on, or at this stage at least, or so for those firms, they are typically also probably the least IT enabled in terms of process, and they're very thankful that they view that their impact would not be that much. So um, they are embracing hibernation in the context of we can ride this through without too much impact on what we do. Now, whether that's once again the right strategy mindset at this point of time is difficult to ascertain. Um, most law firm leaders, Andrea, probably are not finding a space around discussing of how they are dealing with all these variables in all those three categories, around what are the answers around all of this, around managing risk, managing productivity, of how productivity of work from home is considered, and managing client expectations from that viewpoint. So it's a really difficult time for a lot of those mid-tier and smaller firms in particular, and their leaders, around having a space to probably discuss of how everyone's feeling around how things are going, and without being judgmental about no one having the answers at this
yeah because I think that to me is one of the most important kind of things at the moment, that this is a time of great uncertainty, and we're talking about a microcosm here, the professional service firm, but I'm sure this applies to so many. If you're a retail organization and you haven't cracked on an online offering, similar, so I'm saying I understand we're talking about the niche, but it goes wider. It goes in so many directions, Partha, but the idea that it is so uncertain, and we don't know if this is a month. I have everything in my mind from Easter, sure thing, through to when a vaccine becomes available. What's that, 18 months? It could be a very so that creates, perhaps that's what's helping create this connection between the idea of hibernation, literally like a bear. If we can just we can avoid doing anything at the moment, maybe not consciously, pull back. Lots of phrases you've used, I've heard lots: hunker down, hibernate, all those sorts of ideas. And then at what point I think do these organizations go, well, okay, if this is how it is now, what then happens? So is this perhaps a temporary phase? I wonder if it's a temporary phase, as people are just going, this is too much to cope with, I'm just gonna pull back for a bit. So perhaps it's a question of watching this space.
It is, and what you have outlined, Andrea, that what's the perception of how long will it last, and having a path mapped out around that. If it lasts this long, we have a clear model to navigate through that from a strategy and operational viewpoint, and that's a big challenge. Like, one of the things that we see in all three categories is no one's yet ready to probably deal with the stage 4 lockdown, where access to offices is locked or prohibited by legislation instead of by choice, as it is at the moment, and how that impacts service delivery and planning around that. So at the moment, there are a lot of quick fixes happening around someone sneaking into the office, getting a few things done, or a few
Mm,
key people sitting in the office still, and in effect managing the entire team working from home, and that gives the practice comfort that of what they have known before this hit. Now, if that's stopped, then what happens is
mm,
probably something that everyone is not yet sure of how to deal with. That if the office was in, or the HQ was in total lockdown, and your IT or your partners couldn't just go in and do something, and that, so that's a real challenge also at the moment. That what's the discussion um, around those sort of aspects, and how do you knowledge share to see others are how others are solving that, or how others have solved that from that viewpoint, and
mm,
and how can service providers also reach out and help practices at this time, because a lot of it is also this mindset around um, will stop doing things means there's a hesitancy to reach out to service providers for help. That, if this is what our world looks like or can look like now, then operationally what we need to do in the midst of this to make that happen from that viewpoint. Um, so that's also a key part of that hibernation um, type mindset, and it's interesting that because it's come from the government, whether it's creating that um, herd mentality to a certain extent, that this is government mandated, so it's okay to do it, to to as a reaction to that broad regulatory framework, instead of looking at what can we do at an individual level to buck the trend and go out and do
mm,
something which might be risky, but at the same time gives us an opportunity to explore um, newer ways we can serve clients, for example, basically. So,
mm,
and that's happening, but it's probably not yet happening enough around absorbing the shock of everyone's very focused on the P&L, but that intense focus on the P&L is probably not allowing at a strategy level to have some of these discussions to happen. But whether that
mm,
evolves further as we move into this is is something to look out for, and some of the variables that we are dealing with in the context of hibernation strategy, pivot strategy, and how law firm leaders are dealing with this from that view.
mm. I mean, it's interesting you talk about having that space to take a step back. I've seen, so in out in the community of law firms that I work with and around, I've
Mm,
seen everything from people very rapidly making the shift, even though the technology stack might not,
mm, yeah.
people really made a really great effort, made that shift, to the opposite end of people actively not being allowed to make changes to their
Mm,
working um, day-to-day work style. So I've seen
mhm,
that one extreme to another. But you just said something there that made me think of this thing. I got to the end of last week and realized I'd just been massively busy. And so I have a small business, or a little
yeah.
consultancy. Even
Mhm,
I was very wrapped up in this sort of sense of the pace.
yeah.
And so you can see that people leading any organization, it's been a runaway train. So maybe now is the time where people can say, okay, can we allow ourselves to take a step back and
Mm,
find a way to think slow for a little while about this stuff,
yeah.
by which I'm not meaning decades, but
No, but
actually have a moment to sit down quietly and think about what you might do. So um, anyway, so that's great. Thank you, Partha. That's a really interesting perspective on what's actually happening out there in the field. And I think law firm leaders, professional service leaders, this might be the kind of knowing what's happening out there might just help people get a sense of
Yeah,
where their heads at.
absolutely. And that's your session this Wednesday, Andrea, is very timely around that of gathering law firm leaders around that discussion, as you said, around what's happening with and without necessarily having all the answers around how we
Mm,
resolve all of this. And what you mentioned about everyone's running at 120 miles at the moment, that
mm,
encouraging leaders to slow down a little bit and take stock. And um, and it's almost like there's a feeling of guilt if you are not running at 120 miles an hour at the moment, around the intensity of
yes.
what's happening in the broader framework, in your reaction to that. And that mindset, how can we all work to elevate that mindset? We are probably ourselves guilty of that we need to sort of be doing a lot of things to sort of manage the situation, look at the
Mm.
P&L and all those sort of things, but looking at like slowing the speed a bit. But very much looking forward to your session on Wednesday and around that. And thank you so much for your time and sharing some of your experiences in working with a diverse area of firms.
Thanks, Partha. I'm sure we will speak again.
We'll speak again soon. Thanks, Andrea.